Well, let's get started. Glad you're here. If you did not get a handout, there should be some in the back. And if you're joining us virtually, a handout should be also available to you there for you to download. So we're continuing our story here through Jeremiah, and we're going to eventually kind of end the study with Lamentations. It's really a story, a tragic story, of the downfall of God's people and how God had, through Abraham, in a world where humanity by then was doing its own thing, what was right in his own eyes, a world of empires, of gods, of violence, of power playing, of injustice, of taking over, killing, wars and rumors of wars and the mess. So God calls out of that from the beginnings of Babylon, calls out a family, Abraham and Sarah, and is going to nurture. What would it look like to have a version of humanity that is nurtured by the exclusive presence of God? All right? And that's supposed to be a case study for all humanity. This is what it would look like. It will be just and compassionate, and laws will be of betterment and equality, and we'll talk about like debt forgiveness and all kinds of cool things that are supposed to, once again, be a case study to the nations. A set-apart group, a holy version of humanity, once again because of the presence of God. Instead of what does it look like to have versions of humanity raised by the gods, by other worldviews, by other foundational premises. Well, it's what we're all familiar with if you know anything of history or ever watch the news. Right? Pain, suffering, violence, death, the oppressed, and so forth. Sadly, however, God's people often became just like all the other people, instead of vice versa. And we've been tracking kind of that story, showcasing it in Jeremiah, and kind of making broader, ripple out effects, impacts of what that looks like, even unto us. What does it look like to be God's people, to have all the things that make us God's people, all the things that allow us to be transformed and renewed and bettered, yet to put that aside and do our own thing, or more sophisticated, to kind of mesh that with other worldviews that inevitably start. It's kind of like the frog that's in the boiling water, and then all of a sudden you don't know it's boiling. And to this day, that's a very important message. And we're walking through that case study. Today we're going to talk about kind of a judgment unto the nations. We've seen how God has been carried out justice and judgment on His people, and been doing that through the Babylonians, previously the Assyrians, now the Babylonians. But God is going to actually use the Babylonians to bring justice and judgment upon many nations, many groups of people. And so that's really what we're going to talk about today. But let's just, in summary, remind ourselves how Jerusalem got itself in trouble. Let's go to 2 Kings chapter 21. We've read this a couple classes ago, but 2 Kings 21, verse 10 through 15. The anger of the Lord. So the Lord said through His servants, the prophets, Manasseh, king of Judah, has committed these detestable sins. He has done more evil than the Amorites who preceded him, and has led Judah into sin with his idols. The bottom line issue of humanity is idolatry. That's the bottom line. That's really where the rubber meets the road, is our tendency to replace God in a lot of different forms. That's the very conversation the serpent has with humanity, Adam and Eve there in Genesis 3. You could be like God. It's about the heart of the matter is idolatry. Humanity rolls its eyes at God and does its own thing. And so here's that being, illustrated or emphasized. Therefore, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I'm going to bring such disaster on Jerusalem and Judah that the ears of everyone who hear it will tingle. It will stretch out over Jerusalem the measuring line used against Samaria. Remember, the north had been destroyed by the Assyrians 130 years prior, and the plumb line used against the house of Ahab. I will wipe out Jerusalem as one wipes a dish, wiping it and turning it upside down. I will forsake the remnants of my inheritance and hand them over to their enemies. They will be looted and plundered by all their foes, because they have done evil in my eyes and have provoked me to anger from the day of their forefathers came out of Egypt to this day. It's a reoccurring issue. Right? And before we're too harsh on Israel and Judah, it's a reoccurring issue. Right? It's a humanity problem showcased with Israel. And we've covered this, and if you want to read more details, especially in Jeremiah, you can just read chapters 34 to 45. Really emphasizes the downfall of Israel or Jerusalem, Judah. 3 primary complaints: idolatry, corrupt leaders, and social injustice. Those are 3 main complaints God had against His people. Jeremiah 25, verse 8 through 11. Therefore, the Lord God Almighty says, because you have not listened to my words, I will summon all the peoples of the north and my servant Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, declares the Lord. And I will bring them against this land and its inhabitants and against all the surrounding nations. So Nebuchadnezzar, I'll put in quotes, the servant of God, because he's not like all on board with Jesus. Right? It's kind of an interesting dynamic, and we'll talk more about that later. And you can read about that in Daniel, Daniel's interaction with King Nebuchadnezzar. But Nebuchadnezzar's coming. Babylon's going to be the means by which justice is brought upon Jerusalem and the neighboring nations. Next class, we're going to talk about the destruction of Babylon. So there's that as well. I will completely destroy them and make them an object of horror and scorn and an everlasting ruin. I will banish from them the sounds of joy and gladness, the voice of bride and bridegroom, the sound of millstones and the light of the lamp. This whole country will become a desolate wasteland, and these nations will serve the king of Babylon 70 years. So not just Israel or Jerusalem, Judah, but the surrounding nations. So judgment against the nations. Interesting that the main issue God has with the nations is it overlaps with what God demands of Israel, but not as intense. God does not use the same measuring line with the people that are not serving Him. It's important to note. Basically, it's simpler. What the nations really should be doing, and if you want to read more details about this, read Daniel's interaction with King Nebuchadnezzar. What God demands of King Nebuchadnezzar especially, and King Nebuchadnezzar has, like I said, this weird journey with God. Arrogant, completely, think he's all that in a bag of chips. He's like the impersonation or the personification of his gods. And he's grand and great and amazing and arrogant. And he uses all his power to the oppression and abuse of others. That God will hold him in account. That he has all that power and privilege and money and influence. And he literally ruled the known world. and he uses it to enhance a very few and to power play and abuse the majority. So that's one accusation. That how he misuses his power. And two, injustice. Social injustice. Two main things. And because that's the case, God's going to really hold him into account. So there's this time of reckoning. In Jeremiah chapter 46, and mainly we're covering 46 to 49 here. The word of the Lord, this is the word of the Lord, verse 1, that came to Jeremiah the prophet concerning the nations. God will use Babylon, as we already saw in Jeremiah 25, and here also. He's going to use Babylon to basically bring to justice Egypt, chapter 46 of Jeremiah, Philistia, or the Philistines, chapter 47, Moab, chapter 48, Ammon, chapter 49, first 6 verses, Edom, verse 7 to 22, chapter 49, Damascus, verse 23 to 27, Hazor, 28 to 33, and Elam, verses 34 to 39. So we're not going to read all of it. We're going to read snippets of it because a lot of it is poetic, and God talking about eagles and like dishes and, streams and floods, and it's just intense poetic language with a lot of metaphor and hyperbole to describe the inevitable fall of these nations by the Babylonians. Right? So think the practical aspect of it is like war, swords, killing, people dying, domination, fire, ransacking, horses, that kind of thing. But God's going to, in poetic ways, describe all that. And we're not going to walk through all of it. Once again, you can read the chapters. But let's highlight a few. So here's snippets of the message of God to the nation. So against the gods of Egypt, in chapter 46, verse 25 and 26, the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel says, I am about to bring punish on Ammon, god of Thebes, on Pharaoh, on Egypt and her gods, and her kings, and on those who rely on the Pharaoh. I will give them into the hands of those who want to kill, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and his officers. Later, however, Egypt will be inhabited as in times past. In other words, God did not wipe out Egypt. Even though Egypt has kind of a long history and God interacted different times and God's people and so forth, it's kind of been a hit and miss with Egypt. So but interesting that I want to highlight here is that God is really talking about the issue, the problem is the gods of Egypt and how the people then reflect those gods. Now here's the thing, the gods, lowercase g, the words there is often Elohims, which literally the best translation would be spiritual beings, spiritual forces. The issue in English is English. Like we do capital G, lowercase g, and so normally we think of God, uppercase, and then lowercase is just made up stuff. Well, it's more nuanced and complicated than that. So the images that these people groups have, like of a bird or a serpent or, the Ashtoreth pole or, a cow or whatever it is, those are just wood and metal and stone. So those are fake. Okay, Paul will have that argument. Those are fake. Those are nothing. But there's spiritual forces behind it, or representations of spiritual forces. So is there literally a spiritual being that's a cow with horns or a serpent? I don't know if that's the point. But there's spiritual forces behind these physical representations or these idols. So when I say lowercase gods, real or imagined, I'm not saying what I'm trying to say is in one sentence cover both of those things. Parts of it are fake, but there's real forces behind it. So Paul will make this argument when he says, our battle is not against flesh and blood, or sticks, or stones, or bronze, or metals. It's really against the powers behind it. And he calls it the powers and the principalities, like the ruling spiritual forces of the world. Now, what does that pecking order look like? It's communicated in an ancient world using imagery of kings, royal courts, and how most of us don't do government. Is that how it's actually represented, or is that how it actually functions, or is that just the means by which they would have understood some kind of spiritual pecking order in governance? I don't know. But there's something happening in a spiritual governance world, realm, that those powers have their representations as idols and ruling powers here like pharaohs and kings. And they are representing what those spiritual powers are about, which has to do with violence, abuse, death, destruction. We would just probably categorize it forces of evil. Might be simpler to... Am I confusing? Is this... Anybody with me? Okay. So what God is saying here that Paul later picks up on, and Jesus, of course, as well, and then Paul picks up on that even after that, is that the battle really is on a spiritual plane that manifests itself here. So it seems to me more and more, and I don't have this completely worked out or how every instance plays out this way, but to me it seems like the realms we live in mirror each other to some degree or another. What happens in the spiritual realm manifests itself here in certain ways. And what happens here has an impact on the spiritual world. Does that make sense? So in other words, when two armies are fighting each other, it's not just people being stupid. There's some spiritual forces behind it. To what degree, what spiritual forces is the archangel, Gabriel riding a horse? I don't know. We get snippets of some of that explained in what we call the Old Testament. So what happens here mirrors there and vice versa to some degree or another, not much of which we don't really know to understand and articulate. But God's conflict here is not just with the Egyptians, so there'll be a physical punishment. Literally, Babylon will march upon Egypt, and there's kind of turning power there at Gargamesh, and there's a lot of cool things you can go and read about this on the internet. So there's a turning power there, and then Egypt's going to try to come back later and going to get another beating. So there's that. But God is really saying, what I'm really having a smackdown with is the gods, the spiritual world, which is really the 10 plagues. Is not about just physical stuff. I've made this point before. The best translation is the 10 strikes. It's a smack against the gods of Egypt. 10 of them. Okay. All right. Maybe went too far the rabbit hole. Here's against Philistine, for example. One other example. Jeremiah chapter 47, verse 6 through 7. Alas, sword of the Lord, how long till you rest? So God's having a metaphorical conversation with the sword. Return to your sheath, cease and be still. But how can it rest when the Lord has commanded it, when he has ordered it to attack Ashkelon and the coast, which is capital of the Philistine, okay? So he's having this metaphorical conversation with the sword. And the idea is like, we just need to set the sword down. Let's be done with killing, all right? Let's be done with war. But the sword is like, how can I rest? Because the Lord has commissioned me and I'm not done. So the sword's going to come out, and literally the swords in the hands of the Babylonians, and they're just going to do what empires do. Just, and somebody's going to win at great cost. So that's world events. But there's a spiritual backing of these things. There's something happening in the spiritual realm. Here's my point. I think that's still true. Now, I dare not assume I understand what's happening and say, well, this was God brought this storm, God brought this tsunami, God elected so-and-so. That I would be very cautious. I do struggle with a little, what's the opposite of humility? I struggle with a little of that, but I would not go that far. Right? One way of putting it, right? So I think that gets problematic when preachers get up and say, this is happening to these people because God is bringing... Maybe not. I don't have an insight. God didn't tell me, so I shouldn't say. But that it happens, that I think is crystal clear. Okay, another example on the Ammonites. Jeremiah chapter 49, verse 3. Well, Heshbon, for Ai is destroyed. Cry out, you inhabitants of Rabbah. Put on sackcloth and mourn. Rush here and there inside the walls. For Moloch will go into exile together with his priests and officials. Now Moloch, you might note, was a god of the Amorites, also a god of the broadly more Canaanites and some other versions. And that was the god that demanded children to be sacrificed, which Israel and Judah inevitably partake in. And so here, once again, God calls out attention to that God. Yahweh calls out attention to that God and whatever forces are behind it that demand children be murdered, that God is not just bringing punishment on the people group that that worship that God, but really on the spiritual powers behind it. And that worldview God's going to put an end to. And so I don't know if people are still worshiping Moloch, and people still doing evil things, but God highlights that specifically. Then Moab, for example, Jeremiah 48, verse 40 to 42. This is what the Lord says. Look, an eagle is swooping down, spreading its wings over Moab. Kerioth will be captured and the strongholds taken. In that day, the hearts of Moab's warriors will be like the hearts of a woman in labor. Moab will be destroyed as a nation because she defied the Lord. So another imagery, like an eagle is coming down and there's very, very little chance, the little mouse or whatever is going to survive when that eagle just kind of comes from above. And that's the imagery. Like Babylon's just going to swoop in, and all your mighty warriors and all the boasting and whatever else you've been about is going to come to an end. So that's just one other imagery. And these are just a sample. There's, like I said, all those nations. There's several chapters, but it's similar language, and sometimes certain things are highlighted and other things about certain people groups and so forth. Now, let's zero in on one group, Edom, the Edomites. Here's why. There's a very cool, interesting backstory. Obviously, most of us aren't familiar with that world. We didn't grow up there. These are ancient cities, ancient people groups. But there's a shared ancestry between Israel, God's people, and Edom, or the Edomites. So Israel and Edom both belong to the family of Abraham. So Abraham and Sarah, right, have Isaac, and then marries Rebekah, and then Isaac and Rebekah have Jacob and Esau. Remember that story? And Esau is like kind of like hairy and goat-like, is an image there about him. And then Jacob is treacherous. He is crafty. He's like on the heel of the firstborn. Anybody remember an imagery where you got like the heel and treachery and craftiness and heel imagery? Genesis, yes. Yes, they go back to Genesis. So Genesis, right, talks about how we're going to have really two versions of humanity. The descendants of the snake and the descendants of Eve, the descendants of the children of Eve. And those two versions of humanity are going to be at each other. Right? They're going to be stomping on each other. We're going to be at each other. And eventually one representative of the version of humanity and the lineage of Eve is going to stomp upon the descendant of the snake, but at the cost of being bit in the ankle, right? So that imagery is being replayed in the story between Jacob and Esau. And Jacob will come out and be treacherous, which is most of his life, in treachery. He's going to try to gain power. He's going to try to replace the rightful descendant, which, of the family line, which should be Esau. And so that's going to bring a whole mess, right? He's going to get Esau to sell for a bowl of soup his birthright. He's going to then lie and cheat his dying father so that he can get the rest. But then he's going to get nothing of it because he's going to have to run because Esau wants to kill him. Right? That makes for some interesting Thanksgiving dinners, right? So he's got to run, and he runs away, and he's going to spend several years away, but he's going to meet another family member who is as treacherous or not more than he. And so he's going to then remember he's going to be in love with Rachel, but his uncle Laban is like, oh, that's lovely. He has a lovely daughter. That's great. Happy to have you marry her. So you're just going to work 7 years for basically room and board. Oh, that's like romantic. I'm so on board with us doing that again. Let's bring some stuff, implement some things, right? Well, somebody interested in Aaliyah, you can come mow our acre, we got there 10 acres pasture. You can come mow it with a push lawnmower for the next 7 years, and you can marry Aaliyah. So you just start, right? By the time you're done, you just start backwards because it's already time to go again, right? Just a little push lawnmower. That's true love. And it says that those 7 years just went by like nothing. And then they have a lovely marriage, weddings, 7 days, great party, low lighting, drinking, which I don't recommend putting those things together. And then treachery, and he wakes up with the ugly. I don't know if she was ugly. She had bad eyes. I don't know what that means either. Maybe it's one way of saying it. She had a great personality. I don't know. But he gets the one that he really wasn't in love with. And then the father-in-law is like, yeah, it's just not right for the younger one to get married first. You can have her too, but now another 7 years, so, welcome to the horrible mess. Okay. Eventually, that family dynamic doesn't go well. Imagine that. All kinds of fighting and bitterness and bickering and power playing and goats. It gets complicated. Eventually, they're going to leave. They're going to leave and go back home. And then by that time, Esau has grown into a great family line as well. A lot of warriors, a very ruggedy man, ragged man. It smelled like outdoors and goat and hair. I don't know. Wouldn't that be a cologne? So his descendants are the Edomites. and the descendants of Jacob, which eventually later, on his way back to meet this broken relationship with his brother, is changed to Israel. Now, fast forward, they go to Egypt, right? Eventually end up in Egypt. Got 300 plus years later, 400 years later, slavery, the 10 strikes, God frees them. They're now going to go, basically, they're wandering around for the next 40 years. In part of that journey, early on, they are coming through the landscape that now belongs to the Edomites. And there's a conversation there in Numbers chapter 20 where Moses asks permission from basically their own brothers, right? It's a family. Can we pass through your land? And we promise we're not going to take any of your farm stuff. We're not going to eat any of the vineyards. We're just going to literally just geographically walk through. We're not going to, open grazing. We're just going to really... And they say no. And if you try, we'll come and we'll kill you. So it's not a good relationship. It didn't start out well, right? From the womb. It was a treachery, power playing, a lot of lying, a lot of backstabbing, some forgiveness goes on there where, Esau meets, but then Israel. But it's not a good relationship. It's not a good relationship. Very, very intense. Unto this day, unto this moment in history with Jeremiah. So let's actually go to Obadiah. Obadiah, very short prophet. Obadiah is God's voice unto Edom, specifically. Unto Edom. Because Edom in Israel has been a conflict for a long time. The Edomites and the Israelites have been a conflict for a long time. And the Edomites have not really honored the forgiveness Esau showed and have been vicious and arrogant and destructive and vindictive. So Obadiah, there's just one chapter, verses 10 and 11. Because of the violence against your brother, so Edom, violence against Israel, because violence against your brother Jacob, you will be covered with shame. You will be destroyed forever. On the day you stood aloof while strangers carried off his wealth and foreigners entered his gates and cast lots on Jerusalem, you were like one of them. Here's another mess. When the Babylonians finally come and are destroying Israel or Jerusalem, Judah, burning the temple, ransacking, where's the Edomites? Laughing, joining in, taking stuff as well, plundering the borders of Jerusalem and, whatever the Babylonians didn't take. They're part of the problem on their own family. On their own family. Verse 12, you should not gloat over your brother in the day of his misfortune, nor rejoice over the people of Judah in the day of their destruction, nor boast so much in the day of their trouble. Stop laughing. Stop enjoying it. Stop cheering it on. I don't think that's good practice, period. Especially not when you're doing this with basically your family line. Stop doing that. So verse 15, the day of the Lord is near for all nations. So up to verse 14, it's really about Edom, right? And it's all personified basically as just Esau and Jacob. So they keep using that language, but it's talking about their descendants, broadly speaking, specifically the time of Jeremiah. So Edom and Israel. Verse 15, there's a transition. The day of the Lord is near, not just for Edom, 1 through 14, but for all nations. As you have done, it will be done to you. Your deeds will return upon your own head. What goes around, folks, is going to come back on you. And it's going to happen to the nations as well. Here's a cool reason why there's this verse 15, and then we go into nations, 16 forward. The word Edom, the Hebrew, and the word Edom is letters arranged in a way that's playing off Adam. In Genesis, Adam, which later becomes the name Adam. But early in Genesis, Adam is not yet an Adam. It's not yet a person, a name. It's a generic word for humanity. So until there is an Adam and Eve, Adam is just the generic word for humanity. People group, a species. Don't think yet Adam running around. And so what the authors here is doing is noting that really the story of Edom is, it's really an indictment on the story of Adam, in other words, humanity. Because no matter what people group you're in, what ethnicity you're on, whatever race we categorize, we're really all Adam. We're all one family that's been horribly mistreating each other. Horrendously so. Now, we justify that by saying, my people, your people. There's just one people, or was meant to be, Adam. But Adam version Edom decided to be horrible even to its own family line, which is reality, what humanity has been done to this day. We're all Edom, one degree or another, at one moment in time or another. Does that make sense? So it'd be nice, and in our backstory here, right, America most recently, our backstory, there's very clear kind of power plays and these folks against those folks. It would be simplistic, and I would think even helpful, if we could just say, and that's the problem. These, no, humanity's been doing that mess for actually Genesis 4. One brother kills the other. And welcome to humanity. And it continued on with the Edomites. God ain't happy with that. That we're that vicious towards our own family. Now, we normally think of categories, right? Even in sports. Y'all know I'm not from around here, right? You guys. The other day I had somebody ask me, like, I hear something in your, are you from the South? Yes. Deep, deep South. Just keep going, just go further, get into the next, So, it's fascinating to me how intense folks can be with sports. Even two teams, say from the same state, which will go unnamed. Got two teams, two different colors that kind of seem similar to each other, from the same state, and there's some folks, and once again, I won't name anybody, because then some people might get offended there, that hate each other, in a sense. And we're from the same state, right? Now, of course, that's kind of funny and silly, but we really do that all the time. We really do. We really hate on each other all the time. And an easier way to do that is to create categories and put people in them. The categories themselves are indifferent. It doesn't care if it's your color, your height, your hair. Those with hair and those follically, challenged. I mean, it doesn't matter what you categorize it. It's ways to have an us and a them. You understand, like when we colonized the world there, the savage world, that was an easy way to say, they're savage, thus they need us. Right? So we're coming in and we're bringing civilization. Come on. It's just ways to justify the fact that we're power and playing our very own, if we just don't call them our very own. Humanity's done that forever. Still does. Right, we're not just Americans, we're the left, the right, the far left, the far right, the far. I mean, you just go from there. So the story of Edom is really a case study for the story of Adam, which is about humanity. Verse 15 to 21, verse 16. Just as you drank, now it's kind of to the nations, right, to the broader humanity. Just as you drank on my holy hill, so all the nations will drink continually. They will drink and be as if they have never been seen or never been. So in other words, like the holy hill, what he's saying here is when Judah was being destroyed and Jerusalem, who sits on the hill, was being destroyed, the ones of you that were doing the destroying, and even your very family members, the Edomites, were there having a party and getting drunk, in a sense. It's just an illustration, a metaphor, on the hill, on where the city used to be. That's fine. You want to take that approach? Oh, we're going to have a wild party, and you're going to keep drinking and drinking and drinking. What is he playing off again? The cup of wrath. You're going to keep drinking the wrath you participated in, or that you applauded, is going to be the wrath that's going to come upon you. It's going to come upon you. But on Mount Zion, there will be deliverance. It will be holy, and Jacob will possess his inheritance. There's punishment on Israel, on Jacob, but Edom's going to fall. Jacob will come back. Jacob will be a fire, and Joseph a flame. Those are interchangeable. Esau will be a stubble, and they will set him on fire and destroy him. There will be no survivors from Esau. God's not going to put up with that version of humanity that destroys its own. Once again, a case study, not just Edom. If you go back to Jeremiah chapter 46, verse 27 and 28, here's just kind of a reassurance, what we just read here in Obadiah, that God will bring his people back. Do not be afraid, Jacob, my servant. Do not be dismayed, Israel. I will surely save you out of a distant place, like destroyed, carried out by the Assyrians, carried out by the Babylonians. They're everywhere, but I'm going to save you. I'm going to bring you back. Your descendants from the land of their exile will return. Jacob will again have peace and security, and no one will make him afraid. Do not be afraid, Jacob, my servant, for I am with you, declares the Lord. Though I completely destroy all the nations among which I scatter you, I will not completely destroy you. I will discipline you, but only in due measure. I will not let you go entirely unpunished, which is weird. We live in a world where if you truly love somebody, you just validate anything they want to do, right? And that kind of the world we're in. That love is not really through discipline or harsh words or justice or correction. But in God's definition of it, it is. God isn't being petty and destructive. God is being just and disciplining his people. Seems like pain, suffering, but God is trying to teach humanity a lesson and will bring the people back to gather around him. We talked about this last class, which is in what? Jesus. Church. The word church means the gathered ones. It's not random. We are regathering in Jesus what God was trying to do through the descendants of Abraham. but had to scatter because they would not learn. They wouldn't listen. They wouldn't change. They wouldn't better. They wouldn't be just and right and good and compassionate and fair. So punishment and discipline came. But God has promised, I'm not going to leave you to that. It's been measured punishment. I'm going to bring you back, once again, in Jesus. So, what's the point to us? We're sitting here like, oh man, those Edomites, those Israelites, those whatever. Cautious, be cautious. Because really, these are case studies of humanity, which includes us today, still. That claim to be the people of God, right? That live in broader nation communities, that also should be cautious and should take to heart these stories, because God also holds them accountable. But God has called us to be an example to the broken world around us, which includes the political ways we do our political systems today, our government and other countries, and the way we do people and my people, your people. What would it look like if we gathered around Jesus and showed the world what it looks like to be a humanity done right? That's our task. That's always been humanity's task. We've just been quite sucky at it. And it's still what we're to do today. Show the world what does it look like to do justice, social justice done right. What does it look like to be relationships done right? What does it look like to approach racism and do it right? What does it look like to care for those in need? Whatever the issues are. What does it look like to do it right? And that should inspire the world around us. But occasionally, we're like Edom. And this is another caution. We need to be careful when we're boasting and enjoying and being critical and vindictive and just watching the world burn around us, and we're just kind of almost arrogant about it. We should be very cautious, because guess what? Those are our family members. Lost, perhaps, but our family members. So let's not boast when folks from a different political power start to fall, or from people from another people group start to suck. That cannot be who we are, because God did not take that lightly. All right, next class, judgment against Babylon specifically. So we're going to learn some lessons there. We're getting close, right, towards the end of our study as we continue to move along. Let's have a prayer. Dear God, we thank you for the opportunity, the blessings that we get from these stories, the warnings, the case study, the example. Help us to take to heart. Help us to be the people that gather around your presence in Jesus, to show the nation what it looks like to be a people of justice, of love, of kindness, of compassion. Help us to hold back from the tendency to think of us versus them, to applaud others people's pain and suffering, to almost gloat when people are suffering from often bad choices they made. That instead we will lament the brokenness of the world, we will reach out in love and compassion and try to be kind to them as God has been to us. We thank you for Jesus that have come and illustrated and personified all this. In his holy name we pray. Amen.